Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. Today's card uses the sheltering tree set by Stampin' Up. I'm using the tree and then also these leaves, which are going to be covered in snow. I'm also using Snowflake paste, which is very similar to texture paste. It applies the same way, so you can take a look at it here. I'll open it. And you apply it with a palette knife. It's not glittery right now, but when it dries, all of this glitter appears. It's actually really cool. I'm going to start off with some Strathmore watercolor paper. I'm going to cover it first with some masking fluid. So I'm going to take a brush which I have dedicated to this fluid so I don't ruin any painting brushes. And I'll put some on my brush and then I'm going to tap it at the top of the brush. And you'll see some droplets coming out, but it really wasn't coming out that much. I was getting a little frustrated. I'm speeding it up here because I did do it for a long time. I thought it was because my fluid is drying out a little bit, but I actually think it's my brush because I've been using this brush for a really long time. And so it's become kind of stiff with this masking fluid. So I pulled a new brush and it's a little bit smaller, but I was having much better luck with it. So anyway, if you're having a little trouble, try switching your brushes. So I have some nice big droplets and some small ones. I'm going to lift it up here so you can see it. I really covered it up so that it would really look like a blizzard. So I'm going to let that dry, and you can see when it dries it turns kind of yellowy. There was one piece of snow that wasn't perfectly round, so before I apply my ink I just rubbed that off so that one wouldn't show up. Because I'm going to be covering a big area, I'm using my big fat brush again. This is Simply Simmons number 12, and I'll have a link to it. One of the readers found it on Amazon, so I'll link to it for you. And I'm using the brush instead of a spray bottle because I'm going to not cover the bottom part. So I'm going to create this snow bank at the bottom. So I'm going to paint the water on so that I have a snowbank shape. And then from that point up, I'm just going to cover the whole thing with a liberal amount of water. So I definitely want a lot, and that'll help me blend all these colors together. So the colors I'm using are Ripe Persimmon, I've got Picked Raspberry, and Seedless Preserves, and I really love this color combination. It's really non-traditional for a sky, but it looks just so pretty and different. So I'm going to dip my brush in a jar of water. I'm going to pick up my Ripe Persimmon. I always go from lightest to darkest, and I always use a paper piercer to kind of poke my paper down flat against my work surface. When it first gets the water on it, it starts to curl up a little bit, and it will flatten out, but just at the beginning I like to poke it in the middle. And so I'll just hold it in place while I apply my ink, and you can see it's very vibrant in color, even though I have a lot of water. And I'm going a little bit beyond what I drew. It's kind of hard to draw with water because you can't see where you're drawing. But I'm just going to pick up a bunch of this color, and I'll pull down my snowbank just a little bit. And then for the most part, I'm just kind of tapping in a bunch of color. You can see my color is creeping up quite a bit on the left-hand side. But I'm actually glad about that because it'll blend nicely with my next color, which is the Picked Raspberry. And I'm just going to drop this in the next third in kind of bunches of pink, and I'm making some areas dark, some areas light. You don't have to worry about the masking fluid coming off because it is stuck there pretty well. You're going to have to rub it with your finger to really get it off. So the water and the brush aren't going to do anything to it. Now, when I do two colors together, I don't touch them much when I'm actually applying the color. After I'm done, I go and tap in some water like I'm doing here. So right where those two colors meet, tap in some water, and that'll really get the blending going. And then after I've got the water down, I'll see where some of the areas might be a little bit bare from the water. And so I'll just drop in some of the colors and just kind of blend them a little bit with the brush up and down. And then finally, I'm going to apply my Seedless Preserves, which is a really bright purple. I love this color. So I'm going to fill the rest of this cardstock in, and I'll do the same exact thing I did before between the orange and the pink, which is just tap in some water. So I'm going to tap, tap, and then wherever the areas end up being a little bit lighter than I want, I will go and add a little bit extra color. You can see I'm moving it around in between those two colors to get those two blending. And if you start off your cardstock with a lot of water like I did with the brush, just plain water to begin, then this blending process is a lot easier. A lot of the work is already done for you. So I'm going to mix that all together and get it the way I want. I missed a couple of spots, so I went back and filled those in. And now I'm going to let that dry. Actually, no, I missed a spot on the bottom right. You could see my snowbank went up a little bit, so I just filled it in with some of the Ripe Persimmon. So now I'm going to let that dry. You can see how pretty this dried. It's a really nice sky. I love these colors. So now it's time to get the masking fluid off. So I'm just going to rub it with my fingers. It comes off pretty easily. so you don't have to rub too much. And you can see how pretty it almost looks. You could even say it's kind of stars, or it could be snow. And in my case, I wanted it to be snow, but you could use it for stars. So I'm going to take my tree. I'm going to use my Misty because I'm using Memento Rich Cocoa ink, and I cannot remember to buy a refill for this, and so it's dry every time I want to use it. I need to just write that down. So I'm going to ink it up twice because I don't have enough ink on my ink pad, and I'll get a nice image. Now typically Memento inks dry really quickly, so you don't have to worry about them being wet, but I'm glad I decided to zap it with a heat tool just for a few seconds because I'm going to be embossing on top of it, and I don't want my powder sticking to the tree. So I'm going to heat it up just a little bit, and then I'm going to do a test. And oh my goodness, yes, it's still sticking, which is surprising, very surprising. So I got a stipple brush, and I just brushed off all of that embossing powder, which is white embossing powder, by the way. And then I'm going to heat it up again, and I'm really going to do a thorough job of heating it this time, and then I'll test it again. Now, I'm actually not going to be using this embossing powder. I decided to use the Snow Sparkle. But anyway, so let's test it out and see, and it doesn't stick. So now it's perfect, and it's ready to be embossed. So I'm going to take those leaves, and I'm going to place them. It's kind of hanging off the edge here, so I moved my Misty around. I rotated it 90 degrees. And so then I'm going to stamp this in some Versamark ink, which is a clear sticky ink. And then I'm going to take my sparkling snow embossing powder. And it's white embossing powder with glitter mixed in. So you do get white in it. It's some of those glitter embossing powders kind of are clear. This is actually white. So you do get a really nice snow effect with this. I thought my leaves were a little bare at the bottom, so the set comes with a little cluster of leaves, and I just used it to stamp it a bunch of times. I rotated it so it looked random, and then I sprinkled it with some more of the sparkling snow powder, and then I heated to set it. And that is it for the snow. And now it's time for the paste. So this stuff is really cool. Snowflake paste made by Prima. And so I'm going to open the lid here so you can see it again. And I'm going to grab my palette knife, and just as I use with the texture paste, I'm using the bottom of the palette knife. And so you could actually use texture paste in place of the snowflake paste, but the difference is that the snowflake paste will look all glittery when it's done. So, and also what's cool about using this for snow is that you can get kind of that layered snow look. So I'm going to apply it kind of like icing on a cake. And then once I get it all covered, then I can sort of create the lines that I want. And once that's done, I'm just going to take the side of my palette knife, and I'm going to run it against the edges of my cardstock so I get a nice clean edge. And make sure you use a new edge every time you go. And this stuff takes quite a while to dry. I put on a pretty thick layer, and I would leave it for several hours. I actually ended up leaving it overnight just to be sure that it was dry. I'll give you a close-up look. You can see there is no glitter, but it will appear after it dries. And I started to notice that I kind of wanted my tree trunk to not have snow all the way with the snowbank. So I took my palette knife and I started to scrape away a little bit of the snow. And I started to regret it at this point, but there's no turning back. So I tried to fix it a little bit with the palette knife and decided to grab a brush instead. And so I brushed away a little bit of the paste. It did remove some of the ink, the Memento brown ink. But it wasn't that big of a deal because I'm actually going to go back in and provide a little bit of shading with some distress ink, and you'll see me do that later. Anyway, so I got the snow off, and then I scraped it a little bit on the edge to finish it off with my palette knife, and then I just left it and let it dry. So here it is dry, and you can see all the glitter that starts to show up. I don't know if you could see it very well in the video, but it is very sparkly. And now I'm going to add my shadowing. You can just skip this step if you want to. You have to be really careful because you don't want it to look like dirty snow. I wanted it to have a little bit of shading. So I took my Ripe Persimmon, which is, I'm sorry, not the Ripe Persimmon, the Seedless Preserves, which is the purple at the top, and some walnut stain. So just kind of brown mixed in with the purple, and I'm putting a lot of water in here, and I'm being really careful. So I'm going to put a little bit of shading to the left of the tree and a little bit to the right. And I really liked the way it turned out and decided to just add a little bit to the edges at the top of the snow, and then throughout, like where the textured areas were in the snowbank. And this is, completely optional because you already have the the dimension of the texture paste itself. So I just went in here and just added a little bit more color. The Snowflake paste actually takes color very well. It just absorbed the ink in there, but you have to be careful because it's kind of hard to get off once it's on there. But I was really surprised how well it took the color. And that's the finished snow. And my sentiment was a little bit too long, so I'm going to do it in 2 parts. So I'm lining up the last part, which is going to be on the bottom, and then I'll cover up the part I don't want to ink up with some surgical tape. I always use 2 layers just to make sure it doesn't go through. And then I'll use my VersaFine Black Onyx ink, which is a pigment ink, so it tends not to seep through the tape as much. So I'm going to ink up that 1/2. I'll remove my tape. And then this is kind of scary because you spent so much time. I thought about doing it on a separate piece and adding it, but I really wanted it to be directly on my panel here. So I'm taking my risks. And then I'll move the tape and put it on the other 2 words. I'm just covering, not the whole thing, just enough to get my ink pad over there. And then I'll take off my tape and stamp it down, and now these 2 words will be on the top. It's a good way to split your sentiment. And finally, I'm going to adhere this with some tape runner to a neenah Solar White card base, 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch folded. And I'm going to use my MISTI, as I've been doing a lot lately, to align my panel. So I just put the base in the corner, and then I line my panel up on the corner. And then once it's there, I just press down and I get a perfect alignment. Now I've noticed that since I've been perfectly aligning my panels, they're all a little bit short, which is weird. I don't know if it's my trimmer, but my card bases are always just like less than a 1/16 of an inch, like 1/32 of an inch too short. So I get my big scissors and I cut them, and it is perfectly aligned on the left and the top. So it's really strange how that's been happening. Anyway, so that is the card for today. Lots of sparkle, lots of snow. I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.